Hello and welcome to New South Wales Votes, the campaign. I'm Ashleigh Raper. It's not long to go now before voters in New South Wales head to the polls. There's the Coalition attempting to pull off something it hasn't done in 50 years, win a fourth term in government. And Labor's trying to prove it's ready to govern after 12 years in the electoral wilderness. Traditionally, state elections are fought on services, hospitals, transport and schools. And those issues have featured in the campaign, and there's been a particular focus on education. But in a sign of the times, the cost of living crisis has dominated the campaign, and voters are looking for hip pocket relief. Soon we'll have some special guests to discuss this election. But first, let's take a look at what's on offer from the major parties and the other contested policy areas. The Coalition's big promise is to set up a future fund for children where the government puts in $400 and then parents can top it up, and if they do, the government will also kick in more. The nest egg can be accessed when the child turns 18 to be used for housing or education expenses. Labor's big policy is to scrap the public sector wage cap, which currently limits pay rises to 3 and 3.5%. Instead, it says it will negotiate sector by sector. To address cost of living pressures, the Coalition has a toll rebate scheme in place for those who spend more than $375 a year, while Labor promises it'll continue that scheme and also cap tolls so motorists don't spend more than $70 a week. For rising energy costs, the Coalition is offering a one-off $250 rebate on bills, while Labor will only give the relief to pensioners and those on income support and the family tax benefit. On housing affordability measures, the government is offering a choice for first home buyers. They can either pay stamp duty or an annual land tax on properties up to $1.5 million. Labor wants to abolish that and remove stamp duty for first-time buyers on homes up to $800,000. And for renters, both have promised to tighten the rules on no-grounds evictions. Another big issue that's emerged is gambling reform. The Coalition has promised to make poker machines in pubs and clubs cashless by 2028. Labor has committed to a trial of cashless gaming on 500 of the state's 90,000 machines. So that's where we're at. And to take us through the key seats and where this election will be won and lost, here's the ABC's election analyst, Antony Green.
With a week to go till the New South Wales election, it's worth laying out the political landscape of New South Wales and where this election will be decided. First up, we'll look at country New South Wales. There's a few marginal seats out here which could be important and help the government stay in office. First off, Murray down here, it's held by an independent ex-shooter Fishers and Farmers MP, Helen Dalton. If the Nationals can take that seat back, that's an extra seat for the government. There's a couple of marginal seats. Up here we have Tweed on 5%. Labor has hopes for Upper Hunter on 0.5, which is very marginal at the moment, but it would be much safer for the Nationals on federal figures. Goulburn on 3%. It's unusual to see Goulburn on such a narrow margin because Labor hasn't won the seat in that area for 6 decades. But a seat to watch is well above the margin for victory, 11.6%. Monero, but it's a seat that's gone with government at 27 of the last 30 elections. And Labor's brought back a former popular MP for the seat in Steve Wan, so that'll be an interesting seat to watch on the night. But a lot of the election will be decided in Sydney. And for people, I'll explain the political geography of Sydney. North of the harbour, all Liberal. Big band of Labor seats here between the harbour and the Georges River. A few more pockets of Liberal outposts in the Southern Shire and Western Sydney. And some of those seats are blue now because it is a marginal, it is a close parliament and the Liberals are in power. Some of them will go back to Labor at this election if Labor wins. A couple of seats to watch are Holsworthy down here in the south on 6%. It's the seats on about 6% that'll determine the election. But the first two the Labor needs to win is Penrith on 0.6 in Western Sydney and East Hills down here in the south on 0.1. It's surprising the Liberals have held that seat for three elections. And just as a little side, like Cogra, which is Chris Minns' seat, he only holds it with about 0.1% margin for the Labor Party, though nobody's expecting that he'll lose the seat of this election. Now, if the election is close, it's going to be decided on this band of seats here. Now, this is the harbour and this is Windsor Road. This is the traditional political divide of Sydney. Normally the Liberal seats, they're all Liberal north of that and all Labor to the south, but some of them are blue. And there we've got Drummoyne here, which is 13.6%. It's been drifting away from Labor, so perhaps that one's not in play. Parramatta, 6.5%. It's highly likely. That's probably one of the best chances for Labor to win a seat. Further up, we've got 5.7%, Winston Hills, and then Riverstone on 6.2. They're the band of seats that, if that's going to determine the election, if Labor can win all those seats, then they're probably very close to being in government, maybe even majority government. Beyond that, the Liberals have a few other problems, mainly on the North Shore. This is a part of Sydney where the Independents won at the federal election with McKellar, Warringah and North Shore, North Sydney. A couple of these seats, like Rob Stokes in Pittwater, is retiring. In Wakehurst, Health Minister Brad Hazzard is retiring. All of these seats have independents, and every seat the Liberals lose here is another seat which makes it harder for them to get to majority government or to finish with more seats than Labor. So I think that the big picture is there's a few seats in country New South Wales, but largely it'll be decided in Sydney, and it'll be decided on those seats between 5 and 7% that Labor needs to win a number of to end up with more seats than the Liberal Party for minority government, or in fact if they even achieve majority government in their own right.
Thank you, Antony. Let's bring in our panel now. David Speers, who is the host of Insiders, Jahin Tanvir, an award-winning youth advocate and public speaker, and Alexandra Smith, the Sydney Morning Herald State Political Editor. Welcome. Firstly, I'll start with you, Alex. I just want a take on where you think the campaign's up to so far.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting campaign because it's so close. You know, I think what we have in Chris Minns, the Labor leader, and Dominic Perrottet in the Premier are two popular leaders who are both seen as very competent, very across their briefs, and both very hungry to win. And I think that's what that leaves us is a situation where I think it's too close to call. I think what I would say is at this point in the campaign, probably majority coalition is out of the picture, but I do think whether we land in a position where it's minority Labor or minority coalition is still very much up in the air. I know Labor's getting quite bullish and they're feeling quite confident, but I still think it's very, very tight.
David, what's your assessment?
Look, I'd agree with that this is a close contest at the moment, and you know it's kind of fashionable sometimes to say, oh look, it's a bit boring, voters are tuned out, these are two 40-something white blokes, they're not particularly all that interesting, some of they're a bit dull. But I do think, and look, that may be so, but I think what we're seeing in a policy sense in this campaign so far has actually been quite interesting, particularly from Dominic Perrottet. I mean, you mentioned it at the top there, the Liberals are trying to win a fourth election. This is hard to do in modern politics. Yes, New South Wales does have a bit of a history of electing governments and keeping them there for a long time, but it's becoming harder. He was seen as an arch-conservative, so he's got to try and break through that perception, and he has proven to be, in his relatively short time in the job as Premier, he's been bold, he's been reformist, he's been willing to try new ideas, whether it's on gambling, whether it's on this very late in the piece Future Fund for Kids idea. You know, he's rolling the dice. He's got to. He's taking some risks, more risks than Labor. Will it be enough? Well, we just don't know.
Jahin, is it boring or interesting, the campaign?
No, I think my sentiment from this election is I'm very excited. There's always this very interesting buzz around election time, especially on social media. And for me, particularly from my end, seeing a lot of media and coverage around young voters having the key and influence this election, it's so exciting because we had record-breaking numbers during the federal elections of young voters coming in and really choosing what they want the future of Australia to look like. And now we get to see that in the New South Wales context. So I'm very excited to see what happens, and I'm following along very closely.
And we've seen the leaders really try to connect with younger voters. There's a big millennial vote. The biggest voting bloc is people under 40. A lot of TikTok in the campaign?
Absolutely. I think they've finally realised the value that young people have in moving forward and the decisions that they play and just their voice more than anything. So very excited to see. And some of the TikToks have been interesting, not going to lie, but it's one of those things where we just have to see what comes out of it.
Now, cost of living and the campaign, it is the biggest issue. How do you think the major parties have addressed that so far?
Well, the big problem, obviously, in state parliaments, in state governments, is there's not a lot they can do to lower the cost of living. You know, we've had 10 successive rate rises, bills are rising, whether it's groceries or energy. So it's very difficult for state governments to actually do anything. But we know by far and away the biggest issue on voters' minds is cost of living. And I think both have tried to do that probably through rebates is the most obvious way. Both sides have offered something to try and to really help voters. But really the only way they can do it is through giving them some cash, I suppose. And whether that's actually going to convince voters that things are going to be different, under either side, that's a big challenge, I think.
David, do you think that voters respond to cash being thrown at them?
Well, people can be cynical about this, but there's no doubt cost of living, as you mentioned, it's the number one issue, daylight second right now. And I do think we've seen both sides trying somewhat to address that, and particularly targeting millennials. I mean, you talk about it there. The stats are quite interesting. The last election in New South Wales, millennials made up around 18% of the electorate, of the voting population. Now it's about 28%. That's a big increase. I mean, the federal election almost a year ago, millennials played a big role. This, in many ways, is going to be the millennials election in New South Wales, and a lot of millennials rent, and it's already been called by some the tenants election as well. So you can see both sides jostling to show they're doing something on the rental front. And you mentioned some of the policy ideas earlier. They could clearly do a whole lot more, but you know, I do think it's going to be fascinating to see if millennials do decide the outcome of this election, and whether we do, after the election, whoever's in power, see more action to try and deal with, you know, the real crisis a lot of people renting are facing.
Yeah, and we'll get to rent, but I'm just interested for your take on a lot of these announcements have been based around families and the household budget and for children. Do you think that that is problematic if leaders want to connect and both parties want to connect with the youth vote?
Yeah, I think there is a bit of a focus being shifted when we talk about family budgets compared to cost of living that is impacting young people, young Australians. I don't think you can have a conversation these days without somebody mentioning the cost of fuel or the cost of milk. And at my work, for example, at the ASC, we get to work with about 180,000 young Australians. And the main term that we hear is it's survival. It's not about buying a house or, you know, things that usually would, you know, talk about adulthood, for example, as a young Australian, what you dream about. It's more about survival. How do I live paycheck to paycheck? A lot of people are moving with their parents again, which was, you know, a different culture back a couple of years ago. So I think it is a massive focus, and we just have to see how it unfolds.
So we have some voters, we've spoken to some voters, and they're making some really unthinkable decisions to make ends meet. So let's hear from them now.
There's no quality of life for me anymore, and when I'm trying to provide quality of life for others, and when I'm trying to spend time with my own family, I can't do that. I now have to choose between whether or not I'm going to use that last little bit of fuel to continue working, or whether I'm going to ring in sick for a couple of days because I can't afford to put petrol in my car to go to work.
Unless things change dramatically, I don't think I'll be able to stay where I'm living. I've got a beautiful 5-year-old, and I try to manage all my jobs so I can, you know, spend as much time as I can with him. But I do worry with the cost of living that at some point I'll have to work even more and spend less time with him, which is, you know, not really what I want to do at all.
This is the big challenge of the election, and as you pointed out, Alex, the states are hamstrung with what they can do. Do you think that voters want more? They're hoping for more from governments? They've got more up their sleeve to address this?
Oh, I think voters are always hoping for more, aren't they? Yeah, absolutely. But again, you know, it is very difficult, isn't it? And it's also so many competing pressures, like you say, millennials who have certain demands, you know, but there's family budgets. And I think it's a very hard challenge for governments or for oppositions to come up with policies that address the issue for everybody. And I'm not sure in this campaign we're seeing that at the moment. I think it is very much family focused, which, sure. But of course, you know, for the first time, millennials make up such a big part of the voting public, don't they? And whether they're being talked to may make a really big difference in the outcome of this election.
And David, just looking at, you know, how state works in the national framework, do you think state governments are hamstrung with what they can do and there needs to be a bigger federal approach?
It's a good point, Ash. I think all governments are really hamstrung with what they can do about tackling inflation. I mean, you pour too much relief into people's pockets, you're going to make the inflation problem worse by, you know, pouring more money into the economy. So all governments are limited here. State governments, you know, particularly when it comes to those grocery pressures and petrol, there's not a great deal a state government can do about that. You know, what we're seeing is limited action around some energy bill relief. You know, other states have done this at election time, toll caps and so on. The longer term challenges of trying to give tenants more power in the rental market. But, you know, really we've got to be realistic here. There are limits to what a state can do.
Now, I want to move to housing now. Housing affordability, a big issue. And there's two parts to this. The first is trying to get into the housing market, which in Sydney we know is a nightmare in particular. And there's also the rental issue, rising costs and also just really not enough places for people to live. Just first on housing, and And Alex, I'll go to you. Dominic Perrottet has made stamp duty. It's his big policy. It's his big reform that he wanted to do. Yeah. Now, what we've ended up with, the policy that is in place now, isn't what he wanted. It's a scaled back for first-time buyers. How do you think what's on offer from the coalition, the Liberals and Labor, going into this campaign? Well,
I think it's really interesting, isn't it? Because, like you said, Perrottet is very bold in his thinking, and his big plan was to abolish stamp duty. He sees it, as do many economists, many people, as an inefficient tax. But like you said, where we landed was basically another scheme for first home buyers, which I suppose is really good for millennials, getting people into the market, but it also excludes a lot of other people as well. And obviously, I think what happened with Labor is they were forced into a position where they had to come up with something on stamp duty, and it's also around first home buyers. But really, you know, unfortunately for Dominic Perrottet, whether it was politics got in the way, you know, his grand plan of completely getting rid of stamp duty, which the other states probably would have followed. Victoria was interested in sort of following the lead of New South Wales, hasn't ended up there. So we've now got this two-tiered tax system where you've got some first home buyers who can opt into land tax or a property tax, and still the stamp duty system in place. And I just don't see how that in any way helps housing affordability.
Yeah, and just in terms of housing affordability, that was sort of going to be the bigger election issue, but the rental issue has really overtaken that. So let's hear from some renters who have been looking for a long time to find some rentals in Sydney.
I've been looking for the past 2 months, but everywhere is just crazy. I've been putting in over $50 extra on most places and still can't get them. So yeah.
Yeah, look, it's been very difficult. The market at the moment, it's quite difficult to get into. There's been a lot of places that have gone up, you know, at that same price, but people are coming in with ridiculous offers, and yeah, it's just difficult to compete with.
I'm struggling. I'm a single mum with 2 children, and I live in the North Shore, and it's ridiculously expensive, and I'm struggling to stay afloat.
Jahin, do you think that reflects the mood on the ground?
Well, look, when you ask most young Australians currently about being a first home buyer, I think that idea and that dream has really evaporated, unfortunately, in most cases. As you saw from the renters, a lot of their situations are on a moment-by-moment basis, finding shelter, finding rent. And so thinking so long-term about buying a house, it just doesn't even come to your head right now because you're thinking more about livelihood and survival currently. And so I think that is a sentiment. You know, young people will make a lot of decisions depending on their future. We talk about millennials, we talk about Gen Z, and the Gen Alpha that's rising as well, who will soon vote in many cases. So I think it is a big swaying point for a lot of young Australians.
And do you think they tapped into policies, both the Coalition, Labor, the Greens, they're pushing rental? Do you think that people are engaging with the policies?
I think they are in most cases, but again, as soon as you leave your house and you see the rent or receive a letter around how much the rent is this month, it's always swaying your judgment. And I think more stronger policies need to be put into place for immediate action rather than, you know, thinking long term ahead. But again, it's one of those things, as David mentioned as well, it's not something you can fix very quickly, but people are suffering every single day.
And David, the rental crisis isn't unique to New South Wales. Do you think this has been a blind spot and for governments, not just in New South Wales but around the country, and now we're in this situation?
Yeah, I agree, absolutely. It's particularly acute in Sydney, obviously, but you see this in other cities, but also in the regions as well. And I think you know, one of the alarming stats in the context of New South Wales is that over the last 12 months, the number of properties in the state that are available at less than $400 a week is halved, or more than halved. So you can see at that lower end of the market, this is really squeezing a lot of people. Now, what both sides are talking about, you know, various ways to empower tenants. It's not really going to, by my assessment, make a huge difference here. They're not doing things like, you know, tackling the impact of services like Airbnb on the residential rental market. You know, we're not seeing large-scale investments in social housing or, you know, big moves on land release and so on. Look, sure, some of these changes might make a difference. You know, tackling the secret rent bidding, this has been talked about for a while. What they're saying at this election really going to stop secret rent bidding? We'll see. But they could be doing a lot more than they are.
Now, one policy area that has reared its head quite unexpectedly in this campaign is gambling reform and the debate around cashless gaming. Now, David, I want to start with you. Were you surprised that Dominic Perrottet decided to tackle this issue so close to an election?
Yes, I was. But when you step back and look at it from a purely political point of view, you can see why he did it, why this makes a lot of sense. As I mentioned earlier, here's a guy under Gladys Berejiklian who was seen as the arch-conservative in the Liberals. This has been an area, a possibility for him to show, that he does have a social heart that he wants to tackle what is clearly a deep-rooted problem in New South Wales. 90,000 poker machines, nearly half of all of Australia's poker machines. It's allowed him to show leadership and ability to take on powerful vested interests, left Labor looking a little weak on this as well. So yes, I think this has been something that's probably cut through with a lot of voters, even if they're not personally affected by the problems of, poker machine addiction in their family. They've seen this as they've taken notice of what Perrottet's done here.
Yeah, and let's go to the heart of this issue. The ABC has spoken to people impacted by gambling, and we'll hear from them now.
I've got about $50,000 in loans that I am struggling to repay.
I'd had enough. Had nothing to my name. Quite quickly I was in seeing a psychologist, but that didn't stop me. There was another 12 months of hurt.
When you look at that oversaturation within a place like Fairfield, it's not surprising that when there's a casino on every corner that people are more likely to experience gambling-related harm.
Now, Alex, there is a big difference between what the Coalition is putting forward and Labor. What do you make of that?
Well, I think Labor's big fear is what happened to Julia Gillard many years ago when she tried to do some similar changes around poker machine reform. And they just remember, those big protests against her and the power that the club's lobby really had. And that ended that, didn't it? I mean, Julia Gillard couldn't proceed with her planned reforms. And I think for a lot of Labor MPs and within the Labor tent, they're very nervous about that. And I think that is why they just haven't been willing to take the big, brave step that Dominic Perrottet has. Of course, they had the cover of the Crime Commission report, which is obviously one of the agencies that looked into gambling and the problems around money laundering, and its main recommendation was you have to have a cashless gaming card. So in a lot of ways, Labor had that as their sort of cover if they needed it, but for whatever reason, they're out on their own, and Chris Minns just wasn't willing to go that extra step to back in that really important.
David, I just want to bring you back in. Do you think that the ghost of what happened in the Gillard government is perhaps holding Labor back here?
Yeah, I think Alex is spot on. That and the Tasmanian Labor experience under Beck White some years ago, where they were really taking on the pokies industry, got absolutely smashed as well. So yes, those scars are still there. Those bruises are still real for Labor on this issue. Plus, I'm sure there's some thinking that a lot of people who actually think poker machines are a valid, enjoyable part of their social life are typically Labor voters, and they don't want to upset those who are connected to those clubs and so on. That's, I'm sure, part of the thinking here as well. But I do think, in a broader sense, it has left Chris Minns looking a little exposed. It has given, as I say, Dominic Perrottet the ability to look like the leader on the front foot, taking on, a really tough challenge in New South Wales.
And Jahin, do you think that it will make an impact with some voters, into their decision of who they vote for at the ballot box?
Look, I definitely think gambling and gambling addiction in particular is a very important topic, as we can see from a lot of families that are impacted, a lot of communities that are. But in the sense, if it's a make or break decision, I don't think so. As a 22-year-old, for example, the culture of gambling and the pokies isn't as strong as maybe it was 10 years ago. The high risk, high reward is definitely there for a lot of young Australians, but that's more in digital currency, for example, that trend, that popularity. And so gambling in itself, I don't think is going to make a massive difference. It's definitely important, don't get me wrong, we'll definitely acknowledge that, but to sway the young voters in particular, I don't think so.
But Alex, it will be a big issue in the next parliament, regardless of who wins, because there's key independents that are pushing this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's all very well for Chris Minns and Labor to say that they won't do what the government's doing, but they may have little choice if they find themselves in minority government. The Greens, who have already made it very clear that they will not offer support to Labor unless Labor commits to a cashless gaming card. So I just find it quite hard to believe that Labor's not going to have to shift, because they've just, unless they pull off a big win, a majority, and then they can do what they like, can't they? Because, but otherwise, I think they're going to find themselves in a very tricky spot where you'll probably see Chris Minns changing his view somewhat, I would imagine.
Yeah, because they've got the Independents and the Greens
Absolutely.
as well pushing that, and Labor will look to the Greens first if they
there's
end up
something
in
like now, but about 8 or 9 independents, including Greens, who have said without a cashless gaming card, you can't rely on us. That's a significant number.
All right, and that's the program. Thanks to our panel, David Speers, Jahin Tavia and Alexandra Smith.